Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to a new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm here to cover the newest changes to the mod. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2, set in the second age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days. A mod for Total War Attila set in the third age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.4.1 alpha, progressively getting closer to a full release, currently having many factions in the campaign ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video will be a bit different to the previous ones, as of this new update, no new factions have been added, so instead I'm going to be covering the new units added to the mod, all of them being updates to both the Mordor roster and the Orcs of the North roster. If you like the sounds of that, maybe consider giving a like and a subscribe. A small channel like mine really appreciates it. To begin with, in the Mordor roster it looks like several units have changed, specifically the rabble units the faction fielded. The Snaga Spearmen, the beginning spear unit of the faction, have been replaced by the Orc Maggot Spearmen, who for all intents and purposes are the old Orc Spearmen unit that Mordor fielded, wearing mail and scale shirts, crude Viking-inspired helmets and salays, spolders protecting their shoulders, glaives and barbed spears being their weapon of choice, while the unit discards shields, similar to the Tier 2 spearmen fielded by most factions. From what I understand, in an effort to beef up the evil factions based around orcs, a lot of the weaker units have been replaced by tougher ones, and this is as good an example as any. As a result of this change, the previous Orc Spearman unit has changed, all in the unit now wearing pauldrons, spolders and van braces, their chests having additional plates over the mail and scale for defense, using the same glaives and barbed spears seen before, but in combination with heater shields that look to be made of metal, such a shield being ahistorical. Overall, this unit is much more better equipped than it was previously and will make for a tougher and more stalwart battle line. Moving on to a completely new unit added to the faction rather than a redesign like the previous units, we have the Orc Pikemen of the Morannon, who I'm assuming from their name are the guards of the Black Gate which protects the entrance to Mordor. Looking at the orcs, they all wear helmets that resemble ancient Greek Phrygian helmets with attached faceplates. These orcs having faceplates designed to simulate a beard much like their historical counterparts, though these helmets have a longer frill at the back to protect the neck. For body armor, they wear what I'm assuming is an arming shirt with scale armor attached to protect the upper legs, while the sleeves are mail, an articulated plate cuirass with the engraved symbol of the Eye of Sauron etched on it. The arm has been protected by massive pauldrons that double as shields, as well as van braces to protect the forearms, the troops' legs having folds over the scale skirt, while their lower legs have lobstered greaves and sabatons. Discarding a shield, these orcs have cutlasses and falchions at their sides as sidearms, while their main weapon is the massive pike they wield, with this giant glaive head. Such a pike is a pretty poor weapon, as having a massive head on the end of a pike ruins the weapon, as it makes it way too unwieldy, almost all pikes historically having small heads on them so as to not unbalance them or to put too much weight on the shaft and risk breaking the pike. Overall, despite their poor weapons, the orcs resemble pikemen of the 17th century, particularly the heavily armoured infantry of the English Civil War. Looking at the officer, he's mostly identical to his men, except that he uses a brutal-looking sabre or shamshir with upturned killons to catch enemy blades in combination with the heater shield we saw before, a bearskin over his neck finishing off the look. As a unit, these guys offer Mordor something it lacked, dedicated heavy pikemen who more than pose a threat to enemy cavalry and who can grind through infantry formations, the unit being great when on the defensive in sieges, although they are most vulnerable to ranged units and to charges in their rear by shot cavalry and infantry. Overall, a unit that raises the bar for Mordor and makes the faction that much more deadly. With these guys and the redesigned spear line, Mordor finds itself a much hardier threat to horsemen and far more capable of engaging in shield war clashes with the Númenóreans and the elves. Moving on to the sword infantry of Mordor, another change has occurred to its starting unit, the very lightly armoured Orc band, who have been replaced by the Orc Maggot fighters, who are armoured identically to the previous version of the Orc war band, being the sword and shield version of the Orc Maggot spearmen, these troops using scudum shields and bucklers in combination with falchions and short swords. This unit's appearance in the roster now means that the earliest infantry fielded by the Orcs of Mordor are a lot tougher than they previously were. In addition, it means that the Orc War Band, which was armoured identically to this unit, has now been redesigned. The new version of the Orc War Band are very heavily armoured infantry, equipped identically to the Uruk War Band which they've replaced, wearing a mix of skull caps, Viking-inspired helms with eye loops, and crude salays for head protection, while their torsos are covered by scale and mail shirts over which they have articulated cuirasses, arms having spolders, polders and van braces, while their legs just have folds and lobstered greaves and sabatons, using the heater shields seen previously in combination with cutlasses, shamshears, maces with round spiked heads, and others with more tube-shaped heads with spikes, the swords being better at cutting down lightly armoured infantry, while the maces are perfect at smashing up foes in heavy armour. The troops looking like heavy infantry from the 15th and 16th century. If these guys are the more standardised infantry from mid to late game armies, Mordor has become that much more dangerous and capable of going toe to toe with the best infantry in the mod. Moving on to the next unit that has seen change as far as I'm concerned are the Orc Maggots Raiders, who more or less replace the Orc Raiders, although these troops are less well equipped, their only armour being their helmets we've seen before, spolders, very basic single piece folds, and square and round plates worn over their chest, reminiscent of the ancient tribes of Italy and early Roman warriors, who relied on such armour for protection, these orcs only having their tunics for defence underneath. For weapons, the troops use two-handed axes which resemble bardishas, the axes having a spike on the bottom of the shaft for finishing off foes on the ground, the officer having heavy armour we've seen before. As a unit, these are your light shock infantry and are representative of the really low-class orcs fielded by Mordor, these troops only really having the advantage when on the offensive against light infantry, heavy troops making short work of them generally. A useful unit, but one I'd only really use in early game armies. Looking at the Orc Maggots Archers, these troops have replaced the Snaga Javelinmen as your starting range unit, these troops being equipped the same as the Orc Maggots Raiders, except some in the unit wear kettle helms, short swords and machetes at their side, their main weapon being recurved bows with blades on them in the style of those used by the Uruk-hai in the Fellowship of the Ring film. As a starting unit, these guys give your forces greater range and power, meaning your troops won't be at as much of a range disadvantage as they previously were when you only had skirmishers available. Not the greatest unit in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but a useful addition to the Mordor roster nonetheless. Moving on to the Orc Archers, they have now replaced the Uruk Archers when it comes to their role and equipment, the unit now wearing the same heavy armour as the Uruk Archer unit, which is no longer in the roster, this unit more or less becoming the core of your ranged force for mid-game armies, nowhere near as good as the best elven and human archers but still capable at its role. Finally, we come to the last unit added to the Mordor roster, the Orc Archers of the Morannon, who I'm also guessing are part of the garrison of the Black Gate, these orcs being armoured almost identically to their pike variant except for the fact that all orcs in the unit lack massive pauldrons, which makes sense, given these troops aren't relying on their pauldrons to act as shields, their upper arms being covered in mail instead. At their sides, the orcs have the same swords we've seen before, and for their main weapon, they use the same bladed recurve bow. Skipping their bow-wielding officer, these guys are the best archers the faction can field, and will make up the core of your late-game army's ranged forces, being the best match for enemy bowmen and a formidable foe to face on the battlefield, especially when massed. With these guys covered, we'll move on to the changes in the Orcs of the North roster, beginning with the fact that this faction now has new maggot units added to it too, including the Orc Maggot Spearmen, the Orc Maggots Fighters, the Orc Maggots Raiders, and the Orc Maggot Archers in the new faction roster. With that said, we'll move on to the newest unit added to the faction roster, the Orc Skull Crushers of Gundabad, heavily armoured and armed orcs wearing scavenged dwarven armour. For head protection, the orcs wear dwarven helmets reminiscent of hoplite helmets, while their torsos are covered in scale hauberks with ornate breastplates over the top, large pauldrons and spolders protecting the upper arms, while van braces sheathe their forearms, the upper legs being mostly unprotected while the lower legs have the same lobstered greaves and sabatons. For weapons, the orcs use massive dwarven hammers with steel shafts, the weapons being great examples of oversized and impractical fantasy warhammers that are so large and heavy they'd be almost impossible to wield. Skipping their officer who's identical to the troops except with a bearskin over his back, this unit are very heavy shock infantry who can tear apart enemy formations with ease, the unit being somewhat vulnerable to archers and cavalry, which means you should keep their counters off their back so as to maximise their destructive capability. A great unit to see added to the mod, and one that well reflects the scavenging nature of the orcs and their ability to repurpose enemy equipment. Moving on to the next unit, we have the newly added Orc Hunters of Ered Mithrin. Armour-wise, these troops appear to use scavenged elven helms which resemble Corinthian helmets, the helmets having spikes on the front which is an indicator of elven origin. For their bodies, they wear what I can only really describe as a mail hauberk with leather strips attached, such armour very much not being historical, random bits of leather not adding anything to the effectiveness of armour. The troops do have furs on their armour, which makes sense given these troops are mountain hunters operating in the cold, and wearing just metal armour in freezing conditions is a good way to injure yourself. Protecting their forearms, the orcs have van braces and their legs are protected by articulated greaves, some in the unit also wearing sabatons. For defense against enemy projectiles, the orcs use octagonal bucklers rimmed and crossed with metal for additional strength, using a barbed spear in combination with the shield in case of melee, several javelins being slung over their back for use in skirmishing, their main role. The unit officer is armoured like the orcs in the orc warband, however he has the javelins on his back and a barbed spear in one hand to use in conjunction with his metal heater shield. As a unit, these are elite skirmishers who excel at cutting down enemies at close range. While it is true that they are vulnerable to archers given that they lack range, if enemy archers are cleared from the battlefield, these skirmishers can inflict a lot of punishment, although they don't do too well in melee, so keep them away from enemy infantry and especially cavalry. Overall, a useful unit that opens up more tactical avenues for you to wage war with. While I wouldn't make them the core of your army, they can be a nasty bit of additional firepower. Moving on to the final unit added to the faction, we have the Orc War Wargs of Mount Graham. To begin with, these wargs are armoured, which is good to see, their heads being protected by a chanfron, while their necks and the front of their torso have a criniere and a flanchard to keep them safe. Finally, the wargs have greaves to protect their shins, something only very rarely seen in fully barded horses of the 16th century. Looking at the orc riders, they're very heavily armoured, skullcaps with faceplates covering their heads, while they wear the standard orcish arming shirt with scowl at the bottom to protect the legs and mail sleeves for the arms, over which they have partially gilded cuirasses with attached folds for the upper legs, pauldrons, spaulders and vambraces keeping the arms safe, while their lower legs have greaves and sabatons. Finally, keeping their throats safe is a massive bever built into the cuirass, which is nice to see, such armour often being overlooked. In terms of equipment, the orcs have shields that resemble the kite shield-esque shields used by the elves, these being rimmed with metal and crossed with metal, with a large boss on the upper half bearing the symbol of the orcs, some of them being gilded. Kite shields being used by heavy cavalry such as knights during the early to high Middle Ages, before being phased out for smaller shields as the knight's armour progressed. Given these orcs are so heavily armoured, such a shield seems like overkill and could probably be done without. For weapons, they have glaives which would make for terrifying weapons for mounted troops, flashing through fleeing foes with ease. Skipping the officer who is distinguished only by his bearskin, these troops are heavy cavalry for all intents and purposes who give the faction far more mobility and firepower, allowing the orcs of the mountains to more easily contest the horsemen of the free peoples. Vulnerable to archers and pikemen, these troops are nonetheless a great unit to have in your arsenal and will make up the spear tip of your mounted forces. With these guys covered, all the changes I could see have been covered, so we'll move on to the end of the video. Overall, as of this update, Mordor and the Orcs of the North are very much distinct from one another. Mordor now lacking rabble units for the most part and specialising in standard infantry, whereas the Orcs of the North have a lot of lesser infantry mixed with various specialists to give them a bit more variety. Overall, it's a cool change to see and transforms what was once essentially two copies of the same faction, one being a more underpowered version into two distinct and relatively powerful factions. If you guys have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much to you, but for such a small channel, it really does mean the world. Rest assured, more videos on this mod will be coming up in the future, as well as on other mods too. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.